My name is Grace Okonkwo, and on a Tuesday morning in April, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door and handed me a lawsuit. I was wearing gardening gloves and dirt-streaked overalls. My hands were covered in soil from the raised beds I'd been building all spring. The deputy, a kind-faced man with graying temples, looked almost embarrassed as he passed me the envelope. "You've been served, ma'am," he said. "I'm sorry. I hate these ones." I opened the envelope right there on the front porch. The plaintiff was listed as Margaret Van Doren, my next-door neighbor. The complaint alleged that my vegetable garden was an eyesore, causing significant diminution of neighboring property values. She was suing me for $200,000. $200,000. Because I grew tomatoes. I looked up from the papers. Across the manicured lawn that separated our properties, I could see Margaret standing in her bay window. She was watching me. When our eyes met, she raised her coffee mug in a mock toast and smiled. I didn't smile back. I just folded the lawsuit, tucked it under my arm, and walked inside. Then I opened my hall closet and pulled out a black 3-ring binder. On the spine, in my neatest handwriting, was a single word: Van Doren. Inside were 14 police report numbers, 6 HOA complaint records, 47 time-stamped security camera logs, 3 years of meticulous documentation, every interaction, every false accusation, every moment of harassment. Margaret Van Doren had been trying to get rid of me since the day I moved in. She thought the lawsuit would be the final blow. She didn't know I'd been preparing for this moment since day one. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back 3 years to the day I bought my little blue house on Maple Street. I bought the house at 1427 Maple Street in the summer of 2021. It was a small craftsman bungalow, pale blue with white trim, a wide front porch, and a backyard that stretched almost half an acre. The previous owner had been an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd lived there for 47 years. She'd grown peonies along the fence line and painted the kitchen cabinets sunflower yellow. Mrs. Chen sold me the house herself. No realtors, no bidding wars. She interviewed me over tea in that yellow kitchen and asked me 3 questions. Do you plan to tear it down? No, ma'am. Will you keep the peonies? I'll add more. Are you going to be a good neighbor? I always try to be. She nodded, satisfied, and we shook hands. 2 months later, the house was mine. I was 34 years old, single, and for the first time in my life, I owned something real, something that couldn't be taken away. I'd spent my 20s in cramped apartments with thin walls and landlords who never fixed anything. I'd saved every bonus from my job as a forensic accountant, a career that had taught me one very important skill: how to document everything. The day I moved in, I stood on the front porch and breathed in the smell of freshly cut grass and Mrs. Chen's peonies. I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child: peace. That peace lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, my next-door neighbor introduced herself. She marched across my lawn, not the sidewalk, my actual lawn, and knocked on my door like she was serving a warrant. "You must be the new owner," she said. She was in her late 50s, blonde hair frozen into a helmet-like style, wearing a pastel cardigan and white capri pants. She looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog for wealthy suburban women. "I'm Margaret Van Doren. I'm the president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association." "Grace Okonkwo," I said, extending my hand. "Nice to meet you." She didn't shake it. She looked at my hand like it was a fish I'd just pulled out of a lake. "I need to discuss the property standards with you," she said. "The previous owner let things deteriorate. I'm sure you've noticed." I hadn't noticed anything deteriorated. The house was immaculate. Mrs. Chen had maintained it beautifully for nearly half a century. "The fence along the property line needs to be replaced," Margaret continued. It's your responsibility. And the garden in the backyard is overgrown. I'd recommend a professional landscaping service. I can provide a list of approved vendors.
The garden is peonies, I said, and the fence is original to the house, 1942. I'd like to keep both. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went very still. I recognize that look. I'm black. I've seen it before. The HOA has standards, she said. I'm sure you'll want to comply. She turned and walked back across my lawn, leaving footprints in Mrs. Chen's grass. I stood in the doorway for a long time after she left. Then I went inside, opened my laptop, and ordered my first security camera. The first police visit happened 2 weeks later. It was a Saturday morning. I was in the backyard, pulling weeds from around the peonies. A patrol car pulled up to the curb, and a young officer walked up my driveway with his hand resting casually on his belt. "Ma'am, we received a noise complaint," he said. I looked around. The only sound was birdsong and the distant hum of a lawnmower 3 houses down. "What noise?" I asked. "Loud music, apparently, disturbing the peace." "I don't even own a stereo," I said. "I listen to podcasts on headphones while I garden." The officer looked embarrassed. He took my name, wrote nothing down, and left. I watched him go, then looked at Margaret's house. The curtains in her bay window twitched. I installed 3 more cameras that week. The pattern continued. Noise complaints, a report of a suspicious vehicle, my car, a 4-year-old Honda Accord, a complaint about improper trash storage. My recycling bin was 2 inches too close to the property line. Each time, the police showed up. Each time, they found nothing. Each time, I documented everything. By the end of the first year, I had a file 2 inches thick. Police report numbers, dates, times, officer names. I'd started recording every interaction on my phone. I'd installed cameras covering every angle of my property. 47 in total, all motion activated, all uploading to a secure cloud server. My friends thought I was paranoid. "She's just a cranky old racist," my best friend Tanya said. "Ignore her. She'll get bored." But Margaret Van Doren didn't get bored. She got organized. In year 2, the HOA complaints started. 6 in total, each one more creative than the last. Complaint number 1, front porch color not in compliance with HOA palette. The porch was the same color it had been since 1942. Complaint number 2, vehicle parked in driveway for more than 24 consecutive hours. I worked from home. Where was my car supposed to be? Complaint number 3, unauthorized vegetation exceeding height restrictions. Sunflowers. I'd planted sunflowers along the back fence. They were beautiful. Complaint number 4, exterior lighting causing light pollution. My motion sensor security lights. Complaint number 5, compost bin attracting wildlife. A squirrel. 1 squirrel. Complaint number 6, fence in state of disrepair creating visual blight. The 1942 fence, still standing, still beautiful. I responded to each complaint with photos, documentation, and copies of the relevant HOA bylaws, which I discovered after reading all 87 pages didn't actually prohibit any of the things Margaret was complaining about. The HOA board dismissed all 6 complaints. Margaret was not happy. That's when the lawsuit arrived. Let me tell you about my garden, because it matters. When I bought the house, the backyard was mostly lawn, a flat green rectangle with Mrs. Chen's peonies along the fence. It was pretty, but it wasn't me. I wanted something more, something alive. I started small. 3 raised beds for vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, kale. Then I added a herb spiral near the kitchen door. Then a wildflower patch along the back fence for the bees. then a small greenhouse I built myself from reclaimed windows I found at a salvage yard. By year 3, my backyard was a tiny urban farm. I grew heirloom tomatoes in 6 varieties. I had a fig tree in a half barrel. I kept 3 chickens, Henrietta, Gertrude, and Lady Fluffington, in a coop that looked like a miniature Victorian cottage. I harvested honey from 2 beehives tucked in the corner by the old oak tree. It was messy. It was beautiful. It was alive in a way that manicured lawns and chemically treated hedges would never be. And Margaret Van Doren hated it. "I can smell your compost from my patio," she told me once, standing at the property line with her arms crossed. "It's attracting pests." "It's attracting butterflies," I said. "Monarchs. They're endangered." "I don't care about butterflies. I care about my property value." The lawsuit claimed my garden had caused a 15% reduction in her home's value, $200,000 in damages. She'd hired an appraiser, a man who'd apparently walked through her house, looked out her back window, and decided my tomatoes were a financial liability. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd done my own appraisal. 6 months earlier, I'd hired an independent assessor to evaluate my property. His report, which I'd kept in my Van Doren binder, found that my house had actually increased the neighborhood's average value by 3.2% due to the quality of the landscaping and the historic preservation of the original structure. I had the report, I had the photos, I had 3 years of time-stamped security footage showing every interaction Margaret and I had ever had, including several she probably didn't remember. And I had one more thing, something I discovered while researching Margaret's background, something that would change everything. Being a forensic accountant means I know how to follow a paper trail. Numbers don't lie, and people who have something to hide always leave a trail, no matter how careful they think they are. After the lawsuit arrived, I got curious. Why was Margaret Van Doren so obsessed with my property? Why did she care so much about a garden she could barely see from her house? Why had she spent 3 years trying to drive me out of a neighborhood she'd lived in for 15 years? I started digging. The first thing I found was the property records. Margaret owned her house outright, purchased in 2008 for $680,000. But here's what was interesting. In 2019, 2 years before I moved in, she'd taken out a second mortgage, a big one, $400,000. Where did the money go? I kept digging. It went to a business. Margaret's husband, Richard Van Doren, had started a luxury home flipping company in 2018. They'd been buying distressed properties in wealthy neighborhoods, renovating them and selling them for massive profits. The business had been thriving until 2020. Then the market shifted. 3 of their flips sold at a loss. The 4th one, a mansion in Oak Brook, had been sitting on the market for 18 months. The Van Dorens were drowning in debt. The second mortgage was keeping them afloat, and if they couldn't sell their own house for top dollar, they were going to lose everything. Now it made sense. Margaret didn't hate my garden. She didn't even hate me. She was desperate. Her house was her last asset, and she needed it to be worth as much as possible. My unconventional property next door was, in her mind, a threat to her survival. But here's where it got even more interesting. While researching the Van Doren's business, I found a lawsuit, a previous one from 2019. A couple in Hinsdale had sued the Van Dorens for fraud, claiming that Richard had concealed major structural issues in a house they'd purchased. The case had been settled out of court. The terms were sealed. I couldn't see the settlement details, but I didn't need to. I had enough. Margaret Van Doren wasn't a concerned neighbor protecting property values. She was a financially desperate woman trying to bully me into compliance. Or better yet, into selling my house entirely so she could have a say in who moved in next. I put all of this into my binder. Then I called my lawyer. The hearing was at the Cook County Circuit Court, a massive stone building downtown that smelled like old paper and floor wax. I wore a navy blue dress and carried my binder under one arm. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Janelle Cross, who specialized in property disputes, walked beside me. Margaret was already there. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a pale pink suit, her husband Richard beside her, in a tie that was slightly too tight. Their lawyer was a smooth-faced man with expensive shoes and a condescending smile. "Don't let the suit intimidate you," Janelle whispered. "That's what he's for." The judge was a woman in her 60s, named Judge Cynthia Morrison. She had short gray hair, reading glasses on a chain, and an expression that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of human pettiness and was no longer surprised by any of it. "Van Doren versus Okonkwo," the bailiff announced. Margaret's lawyer stood first. He spent 20 minutes describing my garden as a public nuisance, an agricultural operation in a residential zone, and a deliberate attempt to devalue neighboring properties. He showed photos, carefully angled to make my raised beds look like a junkyard. He called his appraiser, who testified that my property had caused significant market depreciation. Then it was our turn. Janelle stood and approached the bench. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit the defendant's evidence binder. It contains documentation of a 3-year pattern of harassment by the plaintiff against my client." The judge nodded. The court reporter, a young woman with dark-rimmed glasses, received the binder. "Miss Cross," Judge Morrison said, "can you summarize for the court?" "Certainly, Your Honor." Janelle walked to the center of the courtroom. Over the past 3 years, Margaret Van Doren has called the police on my client 14 times. Every single call was investigated. Every single call was determined to be unfounded. We have the police reports. Margaret shifted in her seat. "Mrs. Van Doren has filed 6 HOA complaints against my client. All 6 were reviewed. All 6 were dismissed. We have the documentation." Margaret's lawyer whispered something to her. She shook her head sharply. "And now Mrs. Van Doren is suing my client for $200,000, claiming that Ms. Okonkwo's garden, a garden that includes heirloom vegetables, native wildflowers, and pollinator-friendly plants, has somehow destroyed her property value. We have an independent appraisal that shows the opposite is true." Janelle paused. The courtroom was very quiet. "But there's one more thing, Your Honor. Something the court reporter will find in Section 7 of the binder." I held my breath. This was the moment. Judge Morrison nodded at the court reporter. "Please read Section 7 into the record." The court reporter adjusted her glasses, opened the binder to Section 7, and began to read. Her voice was calm, professional, and perfectly clear. Section 7. Plaintiff's financial motive. Exhibit A. Property records showing a second mortgage taken by Margaret and Richard Van Doren in 2019 for $400,000. Exhibit B. Business records for Van Doren Luxury Properties, LLC, showing 3 consecutive losses between 2020 and 2022. Exhibit C. Public listing for 42 Oakbrook Lane, a property owned by the Van Dorens, on the market for 18 months with 3 price reductions. Exhibit D. Court records from DuPage County, case number 2019-CV-08472, showing a settled fraud lawsuit against the Van Dorens related to a previous property sale. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Conclusion, the court reporter continued. The plaintiff's lawsuit appears to be motivated not by genuine concern about property values, but by significant personal financial distress. The defendant's garden is not the cause of any alleged property devaluation. The plaintiff's own financial mismanagement, including a second mortgage, a failing business, and a settled fraud case, is the cause of any financial hardship she is experiencing. Margaret's face had gone from pink to white to a blotchy, furious red. Richard was staring at the table like he wanted to crawl under it. "Your Honor," Janelle said quietly. We move for dismissal with prejudice and for the plaintiff to pay the defendant's legal fees. Judge Morrison removed her glasses. She looked at Margaret for a long, uncomfortable moment. Mrs. Van Doren, she said, did you really think this wouldn't come out? Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. This isn't about our finances. This is about her garden. It's a nuisance. Everyone in the neighborhood thinks so. Is that so? Judge Morrison shuffled through the binder. Because I'm looking at a petition signed by 23 of your neighbors stating that Miss Okonkwo's garden is, and I quote, a beautiful addition to the neighborhood that has made Maple Street a more desirable place to live. 23 signatures, Mrs. Van Doren. How many neighbors do you have? Margaret said nothing. Motion to dismiss is granted, Judge Morrison said, with prejudice. The plaintiff will pay the defendant's legal fees in the amount of $18,400. And Mrs. Van Doren, I would strongly suggest you find another hobby. The gavel came down. It was over. The story should end there. The bad neighbor loses, the quiet woman wins, justice is served. Roll credits. But real life doesn't work like that. There's always fallout. The legal fees Margaret had to pay, on top of her own lawyer's bill, were the final straw. 3 months after the trial, the Van Dorens put their house on the market. It sold for $720,000, $40,000 less than they'd paid for it in 2008. The second mortgage ate up most of the equity. They moved to a condo in Naperville. I heard from a neighbor that Richard took a job at a car dealership. I didn't celebrate. I didn't throw a party. I just kept gardening. The summer after the trial, my tomatoes were the best they'd ever been. The sunflowers grew 12 feet tall. Henrietta, Gertrude, and Lady Fluffington produced so many eggs I had to start giving them away to neighbors. A young couple bought the Van Doren house, a pair of architects named Marcus and David who loved the neighborhood and, as it turned out, loved my garden. Marcus asked me for cuttings from my peonies so he could plant them along their side of the fence. I've never had a neighbor I actually liked before, I told him. Well, he said, smiling, we've never had a neighbor with chickens before, so we're even. The 47 cameras are still up. Old habits die hard. But the binder, the thick black binder with Van Doren written on the spine, sits on a shelf in my hall closet now, gathering dust. I don't think I'll ever need it again, but I'll never throw it away. Here's what I learned, and here's what I want you to take away from my story. Bullies rely on silence. They rely on their targets being too tired, too scared, or too overwhelmed to fight back. Margaret Van Doren spent 3 years trying to make me feel powerless. But I wasn't powerless. I was just quiet. And there's a difference. Quiet people see things. Quiet people keep records. Quiet people wait until the right moment, and then they open the binder and let the truth speak for itself. If you're dealing with someone like Margaret, a neighbor, a boss, a family member who thinks they can push you around, start your binder. Save the emails. Record the interactions. Take the photos. You may never need them, but if you do, you'll be ready. My garden is still here. My little blue house is still here. The peonies Mrs. Chen planted 50 years ago are still blooming along the fence line. And every spring, when the first tomato seedlings push through the soil, I think about Margaret Van Doren in her Naperville condo with no yard and no garden and no power over me anymore. That's not revenge. That's just spring. My name is Grace Okonkwo, and this is my story.
If it made you feel something, anger, satisfaction, hope, or the urge to plant a vegetable garden, then it did what I hoped it would. Now, my question for you: have you ever had to document someone's bad behavior just to protect yourself? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to have you here for the next one. Check the description for more stories like this.